Clint Eastwood walked into that studio the way he walked into every room he had ever walked into, which was without any apparent awareness that the walking into it was something that required preparation or adjustment, or the specific and slightly effortful quality of someone who is entering a space where they are going to be watched and who is therefore composing themselves for the watching before the watching begins. He did not compose himself. He did not need to. The composure was simply there, was simply the condition in which he existed regardless of the room he was walking into, or the cameras that were in the room, or the audience that was in the room, or the 5 women at the table who were going to be talking to him for the next however many minutes that the segment required. The composure was not performed. It was not the carefully managed surface of someone who had learned through decades of public life to present the appearance of ease in situations that were not easy. It was simply the actual condition of a man who had been in enough situations and had survived enough of them and had arrived at enough conclusions about which of the things that happened in those situations were actually worth the expenditure of the energy that the non-composed response to them would have required, to understand that the composure was the only response that made sense, that everything else was the waste of something that he had better uses for. He walked into the studio and the studio reorganized itself around his arrival the way rooms reorganize themselves around certain kinds of people. Not because those people are demanding the reorganization, but because the reorganization simply happens, because something in the quality of their presence triggers the specific and involuntary response of the room becoming more attentive, more alert, more aware of itself as the space in which something is happening that is worth paying attention to. Joy Behar was at the table. She was always at the table. The table was the fixed point around which the whole of the view organized itself, and Joy Behar was the fixed point around which the table organized itself, had been for 30 years, would be for however many years remained in the 30-year-plus project of being Joy Behar at that table in that studio, saying the things that Joy Behar said in the specific and direct and completely characteristic way that Joy Behar said them. She was the thing that had not changed. Not because nothing around her had changed, because everything around her had changed, the co-hosts and the topics and the formats and the cultural moment and the specific quality of what was being said in American public life and what the table was responding to and what the table was producing in response, all of that had changed and continued to change and would continue to change. But Joy Behar at the table was the constant, was the thing that the audience who had been watching the show since the beginning could find when they turned it on, regardless of which decade they were turning it on in. Was the specific and reliable presence of someone who was going to say what she thought with the confidence that 30 years of saying what she thought had given her, and with the specific and slightly infuriating quality of someone who was almost always more interesting than the thing she was saying would have been if someone else had said it, who brought to the statement the specific quality of the person making it that made the statement larger than it would have been without her. She had her questions ready for Clint Eastwood. She always had her questions ready. The questions that Joy Behar brought to interviews were not the questions of someone who had been briefed by a production team and who was reading from a set of prepared talking points that the briefing had produced. They were the questions of someone who had been paying attention for 30 years, who had her own genuine perspective on the person she was about to talk to and on the things that the person represented and on the specific and interesting gap between what the person appeared to be and what the person might actually be, and who had formulated the questions from that genuine perspective rather than from the requirements of a format or the preferences of a publicist or any of the other forces. That shaped most interviews into the shape of the interview that the subject wanted to have rather than the interview that the interviewer was actually interested in having. Her questions were her own. They were genuine. And for Clint Eastwood they were also, she was about to discover, insufficient in the specific and completely unexpected way that things are insufficient when they have been designed for a version of the person that is not the version of the person who actually showed up. The version of Clint Eastwood who actually showed up was not the version that Joy Behar had prepared for. She had prepared for a version that existed in the cultural record, in the decades of interviews and public statements and the specific and well-documented persona of someone who had been a public figure for 60+ years and who had therefore produced an enormous amount of material from which a picture of who he was could be assembled, and from which the questions that would engage him and the questions that would challenge him and the questions that would produce the most interesting conversation could be derived. She had prepared for that version. That version was real. That version was documented. That version had said specific and sometimes controversial things about specific and sometimes controversial topics over the course of 60 years in the public eye, and those things were in the record and the record was available, and Joy Behar had done what Joy Behar always did with available records. which was to read them and think about them and arrive at her own genuine perspective on them and formulate from that perspective the questions that the interview required. What she had not prepared for was the quality of the stillness. Clint Eastwood was still in a way that most people who sat across from Joy Behar at that table were not still. Most people who sat across from Joy Behar at that table had in them the specific and very human quality of the person who is being interviewed on live television in front of a studio audience and millions of people watching at home, the quality of someone who is aware of the watching and who is therefore not entirely still in the way that people are still when they are not being watched, who has a slight and entirely understandable quality of the managed self, the self that is aware of being seen and that is therefore slightly different from the self that exists when the seeing is not occurring. Clint Eastwood did not have this quality. He was still. Not the stillness of someone who was performing stillness, not the stillness of someone who had practiced the appearance of ease until the practice had produced something that looked like ease from the outside even if it required the effort of the practice to maintain. The actual stillness of someone who had simply stopped moving in the specific and complete way that people stop moving when the external environment does not require them to move and when the internal environment is not producing the noise that most internal environments produce most of the time. He was still and the stillness was real and the realness of it was the thing that the studio felt first before it understood what it was feeling, the thing that made the room slightly more quiet in the specific way that rooms become slightly more quiet when there is a quality of quiet that is deeper than the room's own quiet already present in the room. Joy asked the first question. She asked it in the warm and direct tone that was her tone, the tone that carried in it simultaneously the warmth of genuine interest and the directness of someone who was not going to spend the interview in the comfortable territory if the interesting territory was available. She asked about the films. About the specific and long career and the specific and remarkable body of work and the specific question of what it was like to look back at 60 years of that work and to see what it had produced and what it meant and what the looking back at it produced in the person doing the looking. It was a good question. It was the question that the interview required at this point in its progression, the question that opened the territory rather than defining it, that gave the guest the room to go somewhere genuine rather than directing them toward the somewhere that had been predetermined. She asked it and she waited for the answer with the quality of attention that she brought to the answers of people she was genuinely interested in talking to, which was the quality of attention that was not the waiting for the space to ask the next question but the actual receiving of what was being said. He answered it in the way that he answered things. Not quickly. Not with the specific and visible engagement of someone who is warming to the opportunity to talk about themselves and their work and the things that have mattered to them over the course of a long career, who finds in the question the invitation to the kind of reflective self-expression that certain kinds of people find deeply satisfying and who therefore take the invitation with enthusiasm. He answered it the way he answered everything, which was deliberately and without excess and with the specific quality of someone who had thought about the thing they were being asked about and who was going to say what they actually thought about it rather than what the situation seemed to call for or what the host seemed to want to hear or what the answer to the question usually looked like when people gave the usual answer to the question. He said what he thought. He said it in fewer words than most people would have used to say it. He said it and then he stopped because the thing had been said, and stopping when the thing had been said was the natural consequence of the thing having been said, and there was no particular reason to continue past the point where the thing was complete. Joy moved to the second question. The second question was the question underneath the first question, the question that the first question had been the path to, the question that required the first question to have been asked and answered before it could be asked in the specific way that it needed to be asked, which was in the context of the interview that the first question and its answer had created. She asked about the political statements. About the things that had been said in public contexts over the years, about the positions that had been taken and the things that those positions said about the person who held them, about the gap between the artistic vision of the films and the public positions of the filmmaker, about whether those two things were in tension and what the tension felt like from inside it. She asked it with the specific quality of genuine inquiry that her best questions had, the quality of someone who was not asking the question to produce a particular response but to understand something that she genuinely did not yet fully understand about the person across from her. He looked at her. The look lasted long enough to be a thing, to be the specific and slightly unsettling experience of being looked at by someone who was looking at you rather than at the situation you were both in, who was directing the full and unmanaged quality of their attention at the person rather than at the exchange, who was seeing the person rather than the interview. It lasted long enough for Joy Behar, who had been looked at by many people over 30 years of live television and who had developed a very accurate sense of the quality of being looked at and what the different qualities of being looked at meant about the person doing the looking, to understand that what was happening in this specific look was something that was outside the range of the look she had been looked at with before. Something that had a quality she did not immediately have a word for, and that the not immediately having a word for it was itself slightly unusual for a person who almost always had a word for everything immediately. He said something. He said it quietly, and he said it directly, and he said it in the specific and complete way of someone who was not softening the thing they were saying or decorating it with the language of diplomacy or providing the context that would make the hearing of it easier for the person hearing it. He said what the question had deserved to receive, which was the honest answer, the answer that was not the managed version of his position or the version that had been calibrated for the specific audience of this specific program or the version that acknowledged the political valence of the thing being discussed and that adjusted accordingly to minimize the friction. He said the thing that was true about what he believed and about why he believed it and about the relationship between what he believed and the work that the question had been asking about, and he said all of it in the tone that was his tone, which was the tone of someone who had thought about the thing and who was saying what they thought and who was not interested in any of the diplomatic alternatives to saying what they thought that the situation might have seemed to suggest were available. The table received this in the various ways that the various people at the table received things that arrived from directions they were not expecting. Ana Navarro's expression did the specific and very Ana thing that it did when she heard something that she was processing on multiple levels simultaneously. The expression of someone who was simultaneously engaged with the content of what had been said and with the person who had said it and with the situation that the saying of it had created, and who was not going to collapse any of those separate engagements into a single response because each of them deserved its own quality of attention. Sunny Hostin was very still in the way that Sunny Hostin became still when she was in the presence of something that she was going to say something about and that she was not yet ready to say something about because the something she was going to say required the specific and precise formulation that she always gave to the things she said, that required a beat of preparation before the saying of them even when the beat was very short. Sarah Haynes had the expression of someone who was finding the thing interesting in a way that was more complicated than the thing's apparent simplicity suggested and who was going to need a moment longer than the moment available to fully work out the complication. And Joy Behar was looking at him with the expression that Joy Behar wore when she had heard something that she had not been expecting and that required her to recalibrate the conversation she had thought she was going to have against the conversation that was actually happening. She pushed back. This was what Joy Behar did when she heard something she disagreed with. She pushed back, not from the position of someone who was going to argue until the other person conceded, but from the position of someone who believed that the honest response to a position she disagreed with was to say she disagreed with it and to say why and to give the person she was disagreeing with the opportunity to respond to the disagreement, which was the form of respect that Joy Behar's version of the honest conversation required. She said what she disagreed with and she said why she disagreed with it in the direct and specific way that she said things she disagreed with the specific quality of someone who had 30 years of practice at disagreeing in public and who had learned through those 30 years the difference between the disagreement that was useful and the disagreement that was not, and who was deploying the useful variety now. He listened to the pushback. He listened to it with the same complete and unhurried quality that he brought to everything, that did not produce in him the visible response of someone who was hearing something they disagreed with and who was preparing the response to the disagreement while the disagreement was still being delivered, who was already formulating the counter before the point was complete. He waited until she was done. And then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the room. He did not say it loudly. He had not said anything loudly from the moment he sat down. Loud was not the register he operated in, and loud was not the thing the moment required, and loud was not what was going to produce in the room what the moment produced. He said it in the same quiet and deliberate and completely direct quality that he had brought to everything else he had said, and the quality of the saying made what he said something that the room felt in the specific and physical way that rooms feel certain things, that arrived not through the ears alone but through something more diffuse and more complete, through the skin almost. Through the specific and slightly alarming quality of something that has weight, and that the weight is real, and that the realness of the weight is not the performance of weight but the actual thing. He said that he had been watching the show for a while. He said it without explanation of what the watching had produced in him, without the context that would have told Joy Behar or the table or the audience what the watching had meant and what conclusion the watching had led him to. He said he had been watching. And then he said the thing that the watching had produced, which was not a compliment and was not a critique in the conventional sense of a critique and was not any of the categories of response that the table had learned to navigate, because the table had learned to navigate many things and had developed for the navigation the specific and professional tools that the navigation required. What he said was outside the categories that the tools had been developed to navigate. He said it in the quiet voice, and the room went very quiet around the quiet voice, and the quiet that the room went was the quiet that comes when something has been said that the room needs a moment to receive before the room can determine what the appropriate response to the received thing is. Joy Behar looked at him. The look was not the look that she usually directed at guests who had said things she disagreed with, or things she was processing, or things that required more from her than the immediate response could provide. The look was something else. It was the look of someone who has been placed in a position that her professional experience had not previously produced a ready position for, who was in the specific and slightly vertiginous state of someone whose professional ground has shifted beneath them in a way that was not dramatic and not violent, but that was real, that was happening, that was producing the specific and unmistakable quality of a surface that was not as solid as it had been a moment ago. The studio was very quiet. Not the quiet before the applause. Not the quiet of people who are waiting for something and who are quiet in the specific and anticipatory way of the wait. The quiet of people who have witnessed something that they were not prepared to witness and who are in the process of determining what the witnessing means and what the appropriate response to the witnessing is, and who cannot yet determine these things because the thing they have witnessed is still arriving, is still being received, has not yet completed its arrival in the room in the form that allows the room to know what to do with it. The audience was quiet. The co-hosts were quiet. The cameras were running in the specific and indifferent way that cameras run regardless of what is happening in front of them, recording what was happening with the complete and non-judgmental accuracy of the recording apparatus that does not evaluate what it captures but simply captures it, that does not distinguish between the thing that was supposed to happen and the thing that happened instead, but simply records both with the same quality of faithful and permanent attention. And then Clint Eastwood stood up. Not abruptly. Not with the theatrical quality of a person who is making a statement through the standing and who is standing in order to make the statement rather than standing because the standing is what needed to happen. With the specific and deliberate quality of everything else he had done from the moment he walked into the studio, the quality of someone who had decided that the thing that was going to happen next was the thing that was going to happen, and who was implementing the decision with the calm and complete commitment that his decisions always received from him. He stood up, and the standing was its own communication, was its own complete and self-contained statement in the specific and economical language of someone who said things with the minimum necessary words and who had found that the standing was the thing that said what the words would have taken longer to say and that would not have said it as clearly. He said one thing before he turned to leave. One sentence. Not a long sentence and not a complicated sentence and not the kind of sentence that required unpacking or interpretation or the particular kind of attention that complicated and layered things require before their full meaning is available. A simple sentence, said in the quiet voice, directed at Joy Behar directly and without the softening of indirection, without the diplomatic gesture of the aside that makes the direct thing feel less direct by presenting it as not entirely aimed at the person it is entirely aimed at. He said it to Joy Behar, and it was for Joy Behar, and the directness of the for was part of what he was saying, part of the statement that the sentence was making, the statement that said this is for you and it is being said to you and you are hearing it, and it is now part of the record of this morning and of this room and of everything that happened in this room on this morning that the cameras have been recording, and that will remain in the record regardless of what happens after it. The sentence said that some conversations were worth having and some were not, and that the distinguishing feature between the two varieties was not the topic or the people or the context, but the specific and essential quality of whether both people in the conversation were actually interested in the truth of the thing being discussed, or whether one of them was interested in the truth and the other was interested in the performance of the interest in the truth, and that the second variety of conversation was not something he was going to spend the morning engaged in. He turned. He walked. The walk had the specific and unhurried quality of all his movement, the quality of someone who was going somewhere and who was going there in the time it took to get there, and who was not going to hurry the getting there because the getting there was going to happen regardless, and the hurrying of it would not change the destination or the fact of the arrival and would only change the quality of the journey, which was not a quality he was willing to compromise. He walked across the studio, and the studio watched him walk in the specific and collective way that studios watch something that was not in the rundown, that arrived without announcement and that is now departing in the same manner. Leaving in the room, it departed from the specific and slightly changed quality of a room that has been briefly and completely inhabited by something that was entirely itself and that has now gone, and left the room with the awareness of what being entirely itself looks like when it is present, which is the specific and lasting awareness that remains after the thing itself has left. Joy Behar watched him go. The expression on her face in the seconds after he turned and began to walk was the expression that the morning had produced, the expression that was not entirely legible from the outside in the way that expressions are sometimes not entirely legible when the person wearing them is in the process of determining what they feel rather than already knowing and expressing the known feeling. She was in the process of determining. The determination was visible as a quality of the expression, as the specific texture of the face doing the work of the process rather than the work of the expression of the result. The cameras caught it. The audience saw it. And the room was still in the specific quality of the still that follows something. Whoopi said something. She said it in the tone that Whoopi used when she needed to say something that would allow the show to continue while also acknowledging that something had happened that the show was not going to pretend had not happened, the tone that was simultaneously the professional management of the moment and the genuine human acknowledgement of the moment, that served both functions without either of them being performed at the expense of the other. She said something that was warm and that was brief and that accomplished what it needed to accomplish, which was the gentle restoration of the show's forward motion while leaving intact the specific and undeniable quality of what had just occurred in the room, which was something that could not be managed into something other than what it was, and that Whoopi was wise enough not to attempt to manage into something other than what it was. Ana Navarro said something after Whoopi. She said it with the warmth and the humor that were Anna's specific combination, that she brought to things that required both the acknowledgement of their weight and the relief of laughter, that found in the thing that had just happened the specific and slightly absurd quality that most things had if you looked at them from the right angle, which was the angle of a woman who had grown up in Nicaragua and who had therefore developed a very accurate and very durable sense of what actually mattered. And what merely seemed to matter, and who applied that sense to everything that happened in her presence, including the things that happened on live television at the table she sat at. She said something that made the table laugh. Not the big laugh, not the laugh that said the thing was simply and completely funny and that the funny was the whole of it. The specific variety of laugh that says the thing is also funny and that the funny is part of what makes it possible to continue sitting at the table after something has happened that made the table a different table from the table it had been a few minutes before. The show continued. It always continued. That was the thing about the show, the thing that had been true for 30 years and that remained true on the mornings when the most unexpected things happened and the studio and the table and the cameras and the audience all had to navigate the unexpected thing while also continuing to produce the show that was being produced. The show continued and the remaining time of the segment was filled with the things that the remaining time of segments is filled with, the transitions and the topics and the professional management of the forward motion that the program required. And underneath the filling of the remaining time with those things was the specific and lingering quality of what had happened, which was still there in the room in the way that the things that actually happen are still in the rooms they happen in even after the rooms have moved on to the next thing, present in the quality of the air and the quality of the people who are in the room and the quality of the attention that the people are paying to the room and to each other and to the show that they are continuing to produce. Clint Eastwood left the building with the same quality he had entered it. The unhurried and completely settled quality of someone who had done what they had come to do and who had not come to do anything other than what they had done, who was leaving with exactly what they had arrived with because what they had arrived with was simply themselves, and themselves was not something that could be diminished or altered or taken from them by anything that happened in a television studio on a morning that had not gone the way anyone had expected it to go. He left. And the building was left with what his leaving produced, which was the specific and slightly charged quality of a space that has recently contained something that was larger than the space and that has now gone, but that has left in the going the specific and permanent mark of having been there, the mark that does not leave when the thing leaves but that remains in the room as the record of the things having been there, which is the most complete and most durable form that the record of having been somewhere can take. The clip went where clips go. It went there with the speed that clips of this specific quality always travel, the quality of the real thing happening in the managed environment, the quality of something that was not supposed to happen and that happened anyway and that the cameras caught in the specific and permanent way that cameras catch the things they catch, without judgment and without modification and without the collaborative management of the subject and the medium that produces most of what cameras catch, and that was absent here because what the cameras caught here was not managed, was not collaborated on, was simply the thing that happened in the room on the morning that it happened and that the cameras were there for and that the cameras recorded and that the recording preserved in the form that recordings preserve things, which is the form of the available truth of what occurred, the truth that is available to anyone who watches the recording. That does not require the reconstruction of what happened from the accounts of the people who were there, but that is simply what happened, laid out in the exact sequence that it happened in with the exact qualities that it had when it happened, permanent and clear and exactly what it was. Joy Behar was at the table the next morning. She was always at the table the next morning. The table was the table and the show was the show and 30 years was 30 years and none of those things had changed because of what had happened the morning before, which was as it should be and as it was. She said things. The things she said were the things Joy Behar said, in the voice Joy Behar used to say them and with the confidence Joy Behar had in the saying of them and with the specific and genuine quality of the 30 years of the genuine thing that made the saying of them the saying of Joy Behar rather than the saying of someone else. She was there. The table was there. And the clip was also there, saying what it said in the permanent form that clips say things, available and clear and exactly what it was. Which was the morning that Clint Eastwood walked in and said the thing he said and walked out and left the room with the specific and undeniable quality of having been in the presence of someone who was exactly and completely themselves in the specific and uncompromising way that very few people are exactly and completely themselves, which is the way that does not apologize and does not negotiate and does not produce the managed version of itself for the comfort of the room but simply is the thing and lets the room deal with the thing being there and does not stay in the room past the point where being in the room is the thing that being exactly and completely yourself requires.